Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us again. We've got a great show for you today. We're going to be talking all about what exactly is application access and everything that you need to know about it. As always, I'm your host, Justin Ong, and we're going to be joined by a very special guest today. He's a Microsoft MVP. Everyone, please welcome Mr. Nick Cavalancia. Nick, welcome to the show. How's it going today?
Yeah, and going well. That was my attempt at the crowd cheering. Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
For sure, for sure. Nick, thank you so much for joining us. We're here today to talk to our audience about application access. Now, I know this is a term that I think gets thrown around a lot, and but I think there's a little bit of confusion, I think, for some folks out there as what exactly that is and how it plays into both your application policy as well as your security policy. So I was wondering if you could start off by just telling us in your own words, how do you define application access, and
No,
how do you feel like it applies?
it's a great place to start because when we talk about application access, sometimes as IT pros, we're thinking about the granular task of providing access to an application because it's right there in the name, application access. But really, at a higher level, we're talking about identity and access management is probably the more broadly used sort of buzzword or term. It's certainly it's an entire segment of our industry. But as Microsoft is sort of looking at it, they're looking towards the end goal. Well, the end goal is application access, but it's kind of what you're kind of, I'm inferring from some of the things you're talking about. It certainly has some other aspects to it around security. So it starts with this idea of identity. And then at a high level, you're trying to figure out which identities should have access to which applications, which data, which resources, and that includes resources that are in the cloud, and then of course anything that still remains on premises. So I sort of define application access as the entirety of that. So we're really thinking about both creating identities, figuring out what kind of maybe some security roles, or defining how we're going to group identities together, just like we would do, I don't know, roll the clock back all the way to, to Windows NT, which is where I started, NT 3.1. We had groups, and we still have groups in Active Directory, and we're still utilizing groups even now in the cloud. But you're trying to figure out how you kind of combine those together in order to make sure that you're providing the right access to the right resources.
Mm-hmm. So now, as far as application access, how much of that is just managing usernames and passwords, and what more is there to it than that?
Okay, so I think going back to the idea of establishing some kind of definition of roles from both a productivity standpoint, like these are all the people in the marketing department, but also from kind of a risk standpoint of who should have access to what kinds of data, what kinds of applications in the cloud, again, and also on premises and that sort of thing. You're leveraging the principle of least privilege somewhere in there as well. So that way you're not just going and saying everyone can access, everything on the SharePoint site for the sake of argument. Instead, it's limited and scaled down. But then there's also taking it a little farther around the issue of things like implementing maybe even zero trust, which Microsoft is definitely a big believer in. So that's where you're thinking of like at least privilege. It's sort of like a trust but verify. So I've given you the minimal amount of rights that you can have, and I'll let you log on. That was the verify part. But after that, I trust you. Go ahead. I already defined the rights. Do whatever you want to do. Mm-hmm. But in reality, with zero trust, it's never trust and always verify. So the idea here with application access is it's not just about the identity and then giving them access to some application and going, I'm done. That's it. Thumbs up. Right. Instead, it's let me also watch the access requests. Let me look at the specifics around them and that sort of thing, around when is the request made, from where is the request made, is this a request you normally make, those kinds of things, and figure out is there something that's anomalous about the behavior. And so that's the whole of never trust and always verify. And that goes all the way down to even including what apps you're using, the identities, of course, the devices you're using from, all those things. So it's a lot more than just usernames and passwords. It's everything about the access request, if you will.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned zero trust, and I think that's a really interesting segue to the next topic, which is around, obviously implementing a lot of these concepts that make it really hard for bad guys to get in. That's kind of what's most important. But in addition to that, you also don't want to make it too difficult for people who are trying to access things for the right reasons and that should be accessing them. What are some basic principles for how to kind of maintain this balance?
Okay, this is the never-ending issue for IT. even if you roll the clock back 15 years ago, 20 years ago in IT, I go back 28 years, so I've been doing this a long time. There's always been this balance between security and productivity. So I remember a time when literally, because there was no internet and there was nobody that was actually trying to hack into a network or anything along those lines, where every single user would have, let's say, administrative rights on a network. It was just easier. That was what a small business customer did. I don't mean for big companies. I mean like very small businesses, 5, 10 seats, that sort of thing. And so, that's obviously where you go. Productivity is at an all-time high because people can access everything they could possibly need, but security is an all-time low. And then the flip side of that, of course, is if you make things too secure, then users can't get their job done. And so there's always been this need to try and figure out what's the balance. And so part of it goes back to, on the identity side, figuring out what those groups need to look like, what those roles need to look like, how you define that risk on the one end. But on the other end, the productivity, the balance, I think, is somewhat balanced out. This is part of sort of the best practices is IT and security teams shouldn't be doing it by themselves. I think they need to involve line of business owners, department heads. I mean, somebody that's really close to the work that's got to get done, because we tend to think in terms of like, here's the access permissions. They need read permissions and write permissions, or whatever it is for a given application or a piece of data or whatever. But the reality is it'd be better to talk to someone who's very, very close to what needs to be done and also who should be doing whatever it is that needs to be done. So you can best define, let's say if you're using just the concept of groups as the sort of the roles, who should be in that group and what rights should they have? Because we're talking about living in a world where when we're dealing with application access, it's no longer just Microsoft products. It's expanding well beyond that, where other applications are tying in through integration points. And so one account can give access to a lot of different environments, if you will, whether they're cloud or on-prem. So that's a long-winded answer, but I hope that answers the question.
Well, yeah, and I think this ties in next to my next question, which is, so if you are a business owner or a business decision maker, or even an IT decision maker, how much really do you need to care about the user experience when it comes to application access? Okay. Is it
great question?
Is it just about, not having angry, disgruntled users, or is there other implications as well, like security or financial considerations?
So the best security is the one that the user never knows about. And that's the balance. If you can find that balance, you got it, right? So I think user experience is actually very important, because as everyone who's listening to this right now, whenever you happen to listen to these, you know that adoption drives success of any initiative whatsoever. So if users don't like it because it's too hard, what are they going to do? They're not going to use it. They're going to find a way around it. I was just talking to somebody yesterday about the fact that now everyone, since they're working remotely from home and that sort of thing, that maybe the organization has suddenly thrown everybody up completely into Office 365 online, and they're just assuming, for example, they know how to use OneDrive, but they never trained anybody to use OneDrive. Just kind of going along with this scenario, making up off the top of my head. So what happens if no one knows how to use OneDrive, or that it even exists because they've never used it before? Just, some users are like that. They've never used OneDrive. Well, then they realize, man, I used to use the L drive when we were working at the office, and that's how I shared files with Susan. So how do I share files with Susan now? Well, I know I have a Dropbox, so I'll use my Dropbox instead. So that's what's going to happen if we don't think about the user experience. So, for example, Microsoft's got My Apps, and it's their central repository for both cloud and legacy on-prem applications, to try to create not just a single place to launch applications, but in a lot of ways try to create a consistent experience as well. And Microsoft will even, this is some of the words that they'll use when they're talking about My Apps. And that's important because the focus on the UX really does make a difference here. If the users don't want to use it, they're going to go around, and that has implications both from a productivity standpoint, because now they're taking extra steps to do things to work around the organization's inability to deliver them the applications they need, but also obviously the issue around security. Like now they're using an insecure, Dropbox or whatever it is they're using external to what was considered secure within the environment. So, and then you asked about financial ramification, and I think there's a couple of financial ramifications here. And one is the idea of lowered productivity of the user. Also, there's extra costs for IT for supporting and that sort of thing. So those both kind of come into play here. So there is some repercussions here. And then the idea of, if that data goes out of the organization, then we can obviously kind of extrapolate the idea of like, you're out of compliance and there are compliance fines, and and I don't want to do a lot of FUD, but there's that ripple effect that's always possible.
So, like you said, the ideal would be to have a security experience that's invisible to the user that still
Yeah,
maintains the privacy. So, single sign-on, as a user, that's one of the best experiences that I think folks can have. You just sign
sure.
on once, maybe just through your regular Windows
Mhm.
credentials, and then you're automatically logged into all the applications in a secure fashion.
Yep.
Um, but what are, in your opinion, are the security implications of single sign-on, and what would you say are some of the biggest obstacles organizations face when looking into it?
Okay, great question. So first off, I always see sort of single sign-on as more of a productivity tool than anything, just because it makes life easier. I love to use the example of my wife's a school teacher, and the school district has single sign-on, and she provides her Active Directory credentials once on one web page, and then she's able to access a plethora of applications after that. And the challenge is now, putting aside my wife, she's a first grade teacher. There's no real security implication there, except for maybe privacy issues of knowing student names or whatnot.
Sure.
But in a regular scenario business environment, single sign-on provides that value so that there is this productivity bump. But the challenge there is because also we're giving access to so many applications. Um, I read the other day the average organization. I'm assuming this is something where it's mid-market to enterprise, but it was like 80 cloud applications throughout the enterprise. All right. So that doesn't mean every single user has 80 different applications to use, but overall the organization uses 80 different cloud applications. Now, whether the audience watching this believes that number or thinks that number is accurate for them or not, doesn't really matter. It's that there's more than one. There's 10, there's 12,
Hmm.
there's 25 or whatever. The implications are if I don't get authentication correct, meaning I allowed Justin to come in because it was Justin's credentials, so it must be him,
Hmm.
right? Then now Justin's account, whoever's logged in, whether it's Justin or a malicious threat actor or whatever, even if Justin is now turned insider and they're, they've aligned with themselves instead of the organization, they're trying to do something malicious, you now have access to those 10, 12, 20, 50, whatever it is, applications. And so the extra step that needs to be, I think, added to SSO to make sure that it works is multi-factor authentication to make sure that we're using additional authentication assurances to know that that's actually the owner of the credential as opposed to just, they type the password, that's good enough. And so I think if you use SSO without MFA, you're going to have a very bad sort of ripple effect that exists. And by the way, I'm a big believer in MFA all the way down to the lowest level person in your organization has access to a computer. And
Hmm.
the simple example I always love to use is take the mailroom clerk in some big organization, and the mailroom clerk only accesses a web browser, and they go to, let's say, their email, and they go to the postal service website and UPS and FedEx and whatever else, right? Well, if their machine was to become compromised, let's say someone sent them a spear phishing email, they click on a link, their account, the system rather, is compromised, and now someone can gain access to either their system or maybe they compromise their credentials and now can access their Office 365 environment. Then what happens from there is someone could send an email out to basically everybody in the organization. Hey, Justin, you've got a package. Click here for more details,
Hmm.
right? And then now that simple mail clerk that you go, they don't need MFA. It doesn't matter, right? But now in their case, instead, they've become a tool for the bad guy, and therein lies part of the problem. So single sign-on definitely helps to impact the user experience in a positive way. You need the MFA, I think, to make sure that you sort of counterbalance the security concerns around the productivity gains of SSO.
That's a great advice. I wanted to ask you next about a lot of organizations are looking at cloud-based account management providers for single sign-on and just kind of authentication in general. I think in a lot of ways that makes sense as more and more organizations
Mm-hmm.
move to the cloud and adopt more of a hybrid approach. But does doing that, having your account management provider based in the cloud, does that make some of these issues that we're talking about simpler or more complicated, and in what ways?
Okay, so oh boy, both. It's much easier and much more complex all at the same time. All right, so I think if you have multiple cloud identity stores that exist, And an identity store could be something like a directory service, Azure AD. You have on-premises AD. You might have another provider, a third-party provider that does nothing but identity and then uses integration points to access other applications. Sometimes identity stores could really even be considered as the identities that are used inside, for example, Salesforce has their own repository kind of a thing. It could be that as well. But if you've got so many of them, that's where it becomes far more complex. So certainly things like having federated identity helps. So you've got some kind of synchronization between all these different platforms so that there is a unification of going back to our original questions, and then line of thinking was this idea of application access and identity and making sure that the one identity has access to everything, and that federated directory and a federated identity is going to be a big help there. But with all that access to one account, that goes back to my previous notion of you've got to get identity correct, because otherwise you have access to everything. It's one of the reasons why you think about you and I just as regular people, forget our IT credentials and things like that. We have, we always talk about in IT of having different IDs and passwords for every single system, whether it's, my account at my bank, and then another one for if I log into UPS to check some tracking with some packages, and then another one for my email, that kind of thing. We're talking about trying to separate them out, because if one of them gets compromised, you don't want somebody using that with automated tools to try and get access to other systems. And in that same way, if you were to use one ID and one password on all of your different websites that you access, it's going to be a problem. So federated identity is, I think, going to be the part that makes it simpler. But the complexity comes in where you've got to make sure that the security is absolutely correct, because you potentially could be opening a Pandora's box kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. Another element of user experience that not just for the end user, but for IT that seems to be critical, and especially in these times, is password management. Mm-hmm. We've all done it. We've all forgotten our password. It's embarrassing to go to IT. And IT probably has a lot of other things that they'd rather be dealing with than resetting my password.
Sure.
So I think a lot of folks would love to have some sort of self-service password reset. Mm-hmm. But what are the implications of that? Like, what are the benefits and some of the things that you need to keep in mind if this is something that you're looking into?
So from the standpoint of the self-service reset, one of the downsides, of course, would be, and this is the digital version, if you think about self-service, is the digital version of someone calling the help desk, mm-hmm. in essence, because they're going to go to something that says, I need to reset my password. And if you think about the old sort of social engineering idea of, I call you, you're the help desk, Justin, and I go, hey, it's Nick down in accounting, and I forgot my password. I was trying to log in. Can't believe it, can't get it. I make it real friendly and folksy. You might just be like, okay, I guess it's Nick from accounting, and you just reset my password, right? There's no validation and that kind of thing. So the first implication is to make sure that there's some kind of validation. Typically, with any kind of password self-service solution that's put in place, there is a whole onboarding experience that has to happen where I ask you, 8 different questions about what's your favorite car and what school did your mom go to, and I don't know, whatever it is. What did your dad want to be when he grew up? And you answer all these questions. You've got this way of identifying who you are. So that's one aspect of making sure that when the password self-service does happen, that there are ways to validate. It could be questions, but it can also be a lot of other things. It could be an additional factor of authentication. So we could use MFA in the same way that we do for logging on to do a password self-service and that sort of thing. The other part here is make sure that the policies around passwords are also very good and kind of tightly managed here, because we don't want users just resetting their password to something else. Like Microsoft last year killed the recommendation to use to force password changes like mm-hmm. every 60 days, because what would most people do who aren't technical, if their favorite password is like, I don't know, llamas. They love llamas. Go with it. It doesn't matter, right? They would use llamas 1 this month. And what would they use next month? What is it? What would they use?
Llama 2.
Right? And then llamas 3 and then llamas 4. I mean, it's not really all that secure, right? So you also have to have some kinds of controls and policies around complexity, length, the reuse, and so on. And at the same time, and this is sort of outside the spectrum of self-service itself, but maybe some good education for users, so that you tell them, hey, instead of using an ultra complex password that's got 3 letters, 2 numbers, one of your favorite cartoon characters, and it's just like, I can't remember all that. I'm a user. Mm-hmm. I work in accounts payable. I have no idea. One of the good recommendations nowadays is just simply go with a lot of length. Mm-hmm. And so I typically recommend one of 2 things when it comes to passwords, and that is either use three completely unrelated words together. So you've got llama and you've got department and you've got, I'm again making this up off the top of my head, and I've got wrench. It's a longer password, and it's not a regularly formed single English word, so it's you can't go against dictionary attacks, things like that very easily. Or if someone is very good at writing, if you were to write a rather long but grammatically correct English sentence, or whatever language you're writing in, right? That would have enough complexity, and again, also length, that would also be secure. So if you were to say, I'm sure my number one favorite video game is Minecraft or something, exclamation point. I've got an apostrophe, I got a bunch of spaces, I have a whole bunch of words, and it's something that I can remember, but it's not like uppercase L, lowercase J, 7 pound sign, nothing you can associate with. At least it's something I can associate with and easily remember. So longer answer than I think you're looking for, but I hope that all helps still.
Well, great. Again, also great advice. So I definitely am taking that down personally. I want to ask you next, as far as, again, with the IT experience on the side of things, user provisioning is something that can be, like, if you can get it streamlined, awesome. But if you're not quite there, it can be a huge overhead just to onboard one person, let alone a load of people. Are there ways that we can make user provisioning more streamlined? And what have you seen work best?
The first and foremost, well, first off, let's say the goal here, we go back to the idea of managing identity, managing application access, is to reduce IT costs. I mean, there's otherwise, why are we buying a solution or utilizing a solution or whatever it is? What's the point? If you're not trying to reduce IT costs, just make your life easier. That's part of why these solutions exist, is to reduce the IT costs. The number one thing would be syncing the environment, syncing the directories, the identity stores that you have, whatever term you'd like to use, whatever term gets used in the application or platform or whatever you're using in the cloud. You want to get those synced and create some kind of sense of federated identity, federated directory, so that in essence, if you do leverage, and the obvious answer here is automation to help with the provisioning and deprovisioning, you're only doing it once, and then it's sort of replicated out. That's a very, very rosy picture I just painted, because you have to know about all the different applications, and you have to know that the security that you have in one central directory that you're going to be making changes and automation inside of is going to replicate out appropriately. Typically, that would be done through things like maybe having the group sync in the different identity stores, and then use those same groups to give access in their respective applications, resources, and so on. But that's the two parts. The two parts here is trying to find what's the term I want to use? It's not I'm losing my mind here. I can't think of the term. It's an HR term that gets used all the time as well. A system of record. There we go. I couldn't think what I was thinking of. So you're thinking of a system of record, but usually that's about, like, you might use HR to try and make sure that you've got your right title and you've got your right phone number, that kind of thing. But there's sort of a directory service that's going to act as that system of record. It's going to be the hub that everything is going to sync outside of, and looking for automation within that, I think, is going to be one of the keys here to making sure that provisioning, deprovisioning happen properly. And then also thinking, when you make security changes down to those very granular changes, like who's in what group and what group has access to what and those kinds of things, think about that in a grander scale, because you want to sort of, in essence, create one big environment. So you want to reutilize and not repurpose, but reutilize that same, let's say, idea of the accounting group. And that accounting group should be used to give access to the accounting app and the accounting SharePoint site and and all the different things that accounting needs, so that there's a very easy way to streamline this. You can also have other groups for different needs and different access and so on. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But if you want to try and get this down to one directory, if you can, sync it out and then leverage the automation within whatever directory becomes kind of your system of record, if you will.
Now, what about not just the provisioning? Are there ways that we can automate the granting of permissions and access rights, tying it all back to application access? Because, again, I don't want to manually create Nick and then say, okay, you can access this, this, and this, and this, and then I got to move that on to the next person. Like, what can we be doing about this that, again, makes it more streamlined, but is not exposing us to risk?
That's a good question. So the way that you're going to streamline it from a IT productivity standpoint is that idea of trying to simplify it down to maybe leveraging groups, leveraging roles, leveraging, whatever term gets used in the solution that any given audience member here ends up utilizing. But the other thing here is defining those, and then to try to mitigate some risk is to, something I said earlier, leverage somebody who is in the line of business, someone who's in the department. You delegate in a lot of ways so that you get some input from them to make sure you get it correct. But then also think about doing some things like group attestation. And also permissions attestation. So your question was about how do I simplify giving out rights, rather than thinking about it from a perspective of what's the easiest way to give Nick rights to something or other, and am I going to grant him the 6 different permissions he needs? Instead, let's make a group, add Nick to the group, and make it easy that way. That's the simple answer, but the longer answer is things like group attestation, making sure that you get together periodically, or you have someone that's been delegated responsibility that is like that line of business owner, department head, and so on, and they're looking over the group and they're saying, all right, well, it looks like there's 9 people in the group. 2 of them don't need to be in it anymore because they actually got new jobs and they're no longer in accounts payable. Now they're in accounts receivable or something like that. And at the same time, helping with attestation of permissions as well. And so from that perspective, it's are we granting the correct rights that are needed for them to get their job? And then going back to the idea of like the principal of least privilege and using zero trust and that sort of thing. Do I have the minimal sets of rights that need to be granted? And that way we're helping minimize risk by limiting access to only what people need. So that would be kind of the way I'd think about doing this.
Great. Now, my last question really for you, let's say that we've got our application access perfect, and yet
okay,
Nick, the user, still gets compromised by the most brilliant hacker known to man. He's compromised your username, your password, and your multi-factor authentication, and uses your credentials to gain access to things that Nick, the user, should have access to, but to do, bad and nefarious things. Are there things that we can still do to look out for these types of activities, even if the account credentials are valid?
That's a good question. So I'm going to answer it 2 ways. First off, proactively, going back to your scenario of the most brilliant hacker gets past, gets compromised my ID and password, gets past some form of multi-factor authentication. I'm going to say in recent times, if anyone's been paying attention to news, we know that there's stories of getting past at least second factor authentication if it's like text to your phone. We've seen things like SIM swaps. One of the most recent ones was hackers going after access to the cell companies themselves, figuring out how to gain access to like whatever the application is that does the SIM swaps, and then went on the dark web and said, I can go ahead and do a SIM swap for any phone number you want on Verizon's network or whatever it is. I don't know which network it is, so I'm not trying to disparage any one of them and say Verizon's been hacked. I have no idea, but whichever one it is. And so from that perspective, what you're asking is actually really real. It's very possible. So the first thing I would just say is proactively, we would try to address this by using additional factors, coming up with, then there's ways to establish what kinds of additional factors are necessary. If you look at like the NIST standards, it's 800-63B, which is all about authentication and that sort of thing. There's different levels of authentication assurance, and what they really have to do is one with more stringent types of authentication, things that really can't be replicated. Like it's easy to do a SIM swap and sort of replicate using a cell phone for a text message, but having like an app that's been synced with the server that's specific for your credential, that's hard to spoof. Someone have to get access to your mobile device. So that kind of thing, and then also using more factors. So that would be the first step. The after step kind of goes back to the idea of zero trust. So if someone does gain access to, bypasses all that, I don't know, it's Mission Impossible stuff, right? So they've made a copy of my thumbprint and done a retina scan and whatever it is they've done, they're me. For all intents and purposes, they're me. So then what we're looking at is we're talking about monitoring the access that's utilized and seeing if there's anything anomalous about it. So just the simple example I love to give is Steve logs on at 3 a.m. on a Saturday. Steve never logs on at 3 a.m. on a Saturday, let alone any day at all, and suddenly does. That should be a red flag for someone. And someone should be reviewing that, they're looking at their session. What are they accessing? Those kinds of things. So part of this is monitoring as much as is possible that idea of the identity, the applications, the device, the location, the date, the time, all those different factors that kind of come into play, which is all actually lines up with zero trust security principles. But in the idea of providing application access, leveraging identity and access management, all that come together, the real idea here is to watch what does the activity look like, and anything that looks like it's out of the norm, someone's got to be immediately alerted, or depending on the risk level of the individual, that kind of thing, and have a review to make sure that it actually is just. And in some cases, maybe it's a phone call, or it's or whatever the case is, to make sure that it's actually you, or just simply a review of the activity while it's going on.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, Nick, thank you so much again for spending some time with us. As we're trying to wrap up, wondering if you have any sort of final advice or takeaways for the folks that are watching today.
I would say, as you're thinking about putting something in place that is leveraging multiple platforms in the cloud, trying to also gain access to legacy systems on premises, that sort of thing. There's the solutions that exist today are very robust and have really worked through thinking the different scenarios in mind to balance the productivity and security. So the good news is you're not going to be in a situation where you have to compromise one or the other. There's a lot of focus on security. There's a lot of focus on compliance. And at the same time, even with some of the examples I've given today, excuse me, there's certainly a lot of focus on user productivity, because especially in today's climate, if I grow kind of frustrated with the work that I'm doing or the application I'm using, there's a whole lot of other distractions, excuse me, here at home that could take my attention away from work. And so got to keep people engaged as much as is possible, keep it easy for them, that sort of thing. So I just want to encourage you more than anything that the ability to get it right is we're here, and there's lots of great thought put into these solutions to make sure that you can get that balance between security and productivity when it comes to application access.
All right. Well, folks, you heard it here first. Nick, thank you again for your time. We hope you will join us again in the near future. Always a pleasure to have you on. Again, folks, make sure you're utilizing this time to reassess how your users are accessing your applications and ways to improve that experience, not just for them, but for you as well. And until next time, everyone, stay safe, and we'll see you back here next time. Bye, everyone.